Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. A new genocide is underway in Sudan. That's the warning from the UN's former envoy to the country. Mukesh Kapila, welcome to the program. You were the UN's top official in Sudan when the Darfur conflict began 10 years ago. And in 2004, the UN removed you from your post because you spoke out against the failure of the international community to stop war crimes and crimes against humanity. You're now the special representative of the Aegis Trust, which campaigns against crimes against humanity and genocide. And in that capacity, you've just returned from a very long trip to Sudan. You traveled hundreds of kilometers through the country's Nuba Mountains in South Kordofan, we can see on our map there, and through Blue Nile state. Both regions have been ravaged by war in the last 18 months, and hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced. The Aegis Trust estimates that 4 million people have been affected by Sudan's many conflicts, including, of course, Darfur. We're going to look first of all at some of your footage from your trip. Let's have a look at that.
Here we are, just 30 minutes away from the government base in Kadugli. This is how they live. The little children, their mothers, hiding in a cave which is no more than a meter in depth, month after month now, for 2 years. What a way of living.
Mukesh Kapila, how did you get into these closed zones? Did President Bashir allow you to be there?
I wish President Bashir would have allowed me to go there, but of course the Khartoum regime denies admission to any independent observers who could witness what is going on. So we had to go in through a neighboring country by other means.
Was it dangerous then? I mean, you could have been bombed as well, presumably.
Indeed, it was dangerous, and we saw Antonov bombers of the Sudanese Air Force over our head. But of course, our dangers are nothing in comparison to the everyday dangers that the people themselves tolerate.
We saw those children hiding in the caves. Why is the Sudanese government doing this?
Well, it's a long-standing project of the Khartoum regime led by Omar al-Bashir to basically create a pure, ethnically pure state in Sudan. I saw this in Darfur 10 years ago when a government militia tried to get rid of the black African tribes, the ethnic violence, earning the president indictment for genocide in front of the International Criminal Court. And exactly the same techniques are at play now in Blue Nile and in the Nuba Mountains.
In your footage, you explained that the process is getting rid of the black villagers and that ethnic Arabs are later moved in. Is that actually working? Because, I mean, the earth is scorched anyway, so is there anything for the Arabs left, actually?
Yes, it's highly effective. In fact, when you travel there, it's mile upon mile of empty countryside. Villages bombed, fields destroyed, and people living in caves and in the bush, as you saw. What happens then is that after the land has been cleansed and people frightened away or killed off, then other tribes are brought in to repopulate and to take over the assets of the area. And this is already happening in large measure.
We can see there in your picture a totally deserted village there, part of this scorched earth policy. Is the international community then complicit in some way with the Sudanese government?
Well, there is prima facie evidence that what's going on there are crimes against humanity and war crimes. And I don't know why the world isn't doing more about it. I think the international community is maybe a little bit concerned about what it can do, because leverage on Khartoum is difficult. However, there is a lot that can be done. And maybe there is a nexus of interests, whether it's military, whether it's industrial, whether it's trading, whether it's oil related, that is paralyzing the international community.
In terms of humanitarian help, though, in other conflicts, one of the protagonists in your video says that international community would ignore the government and simply send aid anyway if there's a catastrophe. But it's not doing that in this case, is it?
I've spent a lifetime in humanitarian aid. I was the head of the British government's humanitarian program for many years. And we've done cross-border humanitarian assistance in many, many countries, whether it was Bosnia, whether it was Afghanistan, and so on. So the fact that we are not doing it in relation to Sudan simply points to double standards, the cost of which is actually borne by the thousands of people who are now dying there. So why we are not doing that? It is because of, I think, an imperfect understanding of what the situation is on the ground. And I think a naive belief that somehow signing agreements with Khartoum would open up humanitarian access. This hasn't happened so far.
You mentioned the nexus of political interests, but there's also, there was an African Union summit in Ethiopia recently, which you've been very critical of in terms of what it was prepared to do on the Sudan situation. But if there was more courage, there are several things that it could do, isn't there?
Indeed. I mean, in fact, the African Union has tried very hard. However, it has not made progress. And I was very disappointed by the findings of the summit. I was there in Addis myself. Well, the reason is, I think that we are not taking a comprehensive approach. That AU is not, and the UN is not taking a comprehensive approach. Piecemeal approaches to Darfur, to Abyei, to Nuba, and so on, mean that you have a divide and rule. And so a proper political settlement is always torn apart. And of course, Bashir has never honored any agreement that he has actually signed. And I think, again, without looking at the underlying causes of the grievances of these people, which now stretch back, in some cases, to several decades, there is very unlikely to be any reasonable settlement of the conflict that we witness. So
an imperfect understanding of what's happening, but also a fear of the Sudanese government, obviously, in the AU. And is that really, would you say that that's the fear, is it the fear that is preventing an investigation of the prima facie evidence of what's happening and possible extension of travel bans against Sudanese officials?
Well, what needs to happen, for example, is diplomatic isolation of Khartoum. I don't see why so many countries, including my own, the British government, has embassies, and I hate the thought of my ambassador shaking hands with a murderous dictator, whenever they might meet. Hopefully that's very little. For example, there could be economic embargoes. The reason Khartoum is able to have MiG fighters, anti-personnel landmines, and all this armaments that I saw on the ground is because it earns the money to buy them off on the open market, and someone is supplying them. So arms embargoes, economic embargoes can do a lot to degrade the means for making war that the Khartoum regime has. In addition to that, I think an investigation needs to take place on what is happening in the Nuba Mountains and in Blue Nile. We did it in Darfur after I spoke up 10 years ago, but by then it was too late. The genocide in Darfur was already complete. And now we are seeing the completion of the ethnic cleansing or genocide in the two other territories.
To go back to your experience in Darfur, you've actually written an account of those days, Against a Tide of Evil, it's called, which is published by Random House in March, so in just a month from now. Just explain to us briefly why you blew the whistle and what were these kind of entrenched interests that you were coming up against in the United Nations.
Yeah. Well, 10 years ago, when I arrived as the UN's top person in the Sudan, I expected to preside over the end of Africa's longest-running war, which had generated the world's biggest number of refugees internally displaced. Instead, I found that we were facing Darfur. And then when I said that what was going on in Darfur were terrible crimes against humanity, and I mentioned this to the governments and the Security Council, as well as within the United Nations at the highest level, including Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General himself, the reaction was, this is very inconvenient at the moment. We've got Iraq war to deal with. We've got the peace process between the Nawasha agreements, which led to South Sudan's independence. And we'll get around to the issues that you were talking about, Mukesh, when we are ready for it. And I said that it was morally unethical to trade off the suffering of the people of Darfur against, if you like, the greater good, as was seen by that particular time.
With respect, a lone whistleblower doesn't change the situation, but did you feel that if other people had spoken out, that could have actually changed the extent of the crimes being committed in Darfur?
No, a lone whistleblower can make a difference. It depends on who the whistleblower is. When the head of the United Nations, the senior-most official of the international community, if you like, says that his host government, the Bashir's government of Khartoum, is committing crimes against humanity, then that makes it, credible. And that's what happened. So yes, other people need to speak out as well, but most important is people in office, in power, need to speak out. It is not ordinary national governments, Security Council, who have got intelligence and other sources of information far more than ordinary people have. This is not a matter just for street activists and human rights agitators on the streets. It is a matter for those who hold the highest responsibility to protect, which includes the great institutions, the Security Council, the United Nations. And remember that Kofi Annan failed in Srebrenica, he failed in Rwanda, and disappointingly enough, you see, this was another failure of the leadership of that particular time.
You just alluded in your language there, Mukesh Kapila, to the UN concept of responsibility to protect civilians. What do you make of that principle today as we face the situations in Syria and in Mali?
I think the concept of responsibility to protect is a very noble one, and the ideals behind it deserve our highest support. Unfortunately, it has got used and abused and derailed by the real politic of the world by applying it selectively. And, some people call it, for example, the responsibility to procrastinate. And we are seeing that in Syria. We are certainly seeing that in Sudan. So I think it's sad that a concept such as R2P should actually provide a false alibi, a false hope to people behind which the world's most violent dictators and human rights abusers continue to commit their crimes while we procrastinate.
Okay, on that powerful closing statement, we'll have to end. Thank you so much for being here. Mukesh Kapila, Special Representative for the Aegis Trust, which campaigns against crimes against humanity and genocide. Thanks for watching France 24.